So I'm both a little sad and a little happy. It's my last announcement of a talk as director. So welcome everybody. I hope this will be a traditional to continue because the talks are great. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce today fellow Cator.
Cator is fine.
Who has been with us for 3 or 4 months now, and she's been a great citizen of our community. It's been a pleasure to have her around and to have all the discussions and so on. I'm sure you all discussed with her. But today she'll be telling us actually what brought her here and a little bit of her work, which is also very good to know. And so you might recognize Amsterdam, but the work that Charlotte's doing, which is discussing it a little bit, is really wonderful in the sense of connecting a lot of the dots of the questions we've been asking, right? It's really about how a lot of the emerging policies for urban spaces and other spaces of sustainable development, of climate change, and of environmental justice are really landing on the ground, are affecting communities and organizations, how they're interacting with each other in order to enact them, but also fight them, all the kind of things that communities and cities do. And so she's been particularly studying what happens in the context of Amsterdam. She is doing her PhD at the Copenhagen School of Business and is very much involved in studies in other parts of Europe. So thank you so much, Charlotte. You've been really wonderful to have you. We're so interested in listening to your studies.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and thanks for that really kind introduction. Thanks for having me here to give this talk. It's an honor to present in front of you. And thank you also for hosting me formally and making me feel very much at home here in a relatively short period of time. I've really thoroughly enjoyed talking to each and every one of you. I've learned a lot. Some of those sort of hints you'll see through the presentation, for example, maps like this are, relatively new to me. But it's been a really fruitful period for me to be here. And I'm looking forward to present, parts of a big chunk of the project I'm working on, as Luis said, the just and sustainable transformations that are going on in Amsterdam. And I've been writing up the most sort of biggest parts of my analysis in the past couple of weeks, months. You've probably seen me sitting in a corner kind of frantically writing. And that's the kind of part that I will mostly be focusing on today. So maybe to paint the picture of my project a little bit, and please feel free to jump in with questions at any point you might have them. So I am at a business school. My background is originally in economics and in philosophy. So it might be a little bit surprising perhaps that I'm suddenly here at an Institute for Urban Innovation. But in a way, I understand the economy as a way to understand the organization of society more broadly. I see this sort of as a tool through which we can understand other mechanisms in society and the organization of society as a whole. And through critically engaging with that economy and that mode of organization as a way to do that more justly or more democratic. That's, I think, very much reflected in this project, where I study the sustainability strategies and developments in Amsterdam with a specific focus on just inclusion of citizens in those processes. I'm doing an in-depth case study of Amsterdam, very much also, as Luis said, on the ground, looking at the mechanisms that are at play when we have these bold visions and strategies of sustainability and inclusion. I'm not working quantitatively, as you by now surely all know. I'll talk a little bit about my methods, but I'm inspired by critical urban studies, and I use qualitative methods to understand what's actually going on empirically. I'm in the last year of this 3-year project, and as I said, I've completed my fieldwork. I've been writing the first drafts of my analysis, and that's what I'll be focusing. That also means that I haven't quite yet sort of made my conclusions and reflected thoroughly on my analysis. So the findings that I am presented are preliminary. I'm very happy to hear any thoughts or sort of reflections that you might have as well. But I'll also talk a little bit about why I think it's useful and important to do such an in-depth case study as I'm doing. And I guess that brings me to the empirical setting first. We've all heard a lot about cities being at the forefront of fighting climate change, both in terms of the ways in which cities are affected, but also the ways that cities are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and then also the responses within cities to fight those consequences. And the Netherlands is a quite salient case, as many of you will probably know. The Netherlands is largely located below sea level. To be a bit more precise, the blue purplish area is water if we don't take care. So the blue areas are below sea level, and the yellow dot is where Amsterdam is located. So in terms of vulnerabilities and climate change, Amsterdam has some thinking to do there. And current prognoses for 2100 tell us that there's an expected sea level rise between, and I translated this from meters to feet, I hope it makes sense, between 1.3 and 6.5. The expectation is that Amsterdam will be fine with the sort of current protection mechanisms that the Netherlands has been building up. But if these trends continue, then by 2200, it might be very difficult to protect the city from sea level rise and the consequences that come with that. And of course, like any other city, as I know many of you know much more about than I do, extreme heat waves and more droughts are also part of this. So cities, and Amsterdam in particular, are at the forefront of fighting climate change. Well, what I'm interested in is to sort of understand how, if we know that, and if we want to implement policies that address this, how that plays out. What are the mechanisms if we have this sort of bold and progressive, in this case, vision of how the future should look? How does that play out? So what are the sort of mechanisms when we implement these things? And again, here, I think it's interesting to look at Amsterdam. It has sort of international image, but also a history sort of in academia and in academic debates of being an example for a Western European city where the state had a relatively large role in developing the city. And the state has, especially in Amsterdam, had a very sort of firm hand in the development of the city and decommodifying the city in some aspects, for example, housing, which I'll touch upon later. Also, Susan Feinstein, the American urban planning scholar, has discussed the example of Amsterdam a couple of times as the approximation or the really existing just city. And for her, the just city is a city that takes seriously ideas of equity, of democracy and diversity in urban planning practices. And also when we look at the current strategies for sustainability and circular economy, which I will talk about a little bit later or in a minute, this idea of the lived experiences of cities, of citizens and their inclusion in the processes of making these strategies, but also implementing them is quite pronounced. And that's what sparked my interest initially, but it's also a continuation of what I think is a sort of a development in the studying of. So I'm interested in how this idea of citizen inclusion in sustainability plays out on the ground. I'm not looking for sort of directly generalizable knowledge, but I am looking at the sort of mechanisms that are at play when we try to make a city more just and more sustainable. And I think Amsterdam is an interesting case, either as an extreme case, because it has this history of citizen inclusion in urban planning. So it might also be a good place to start looking for sustainability practices that are more inclusive of citizens. But on the other hand, it might also be a critical case, because if in Amsterdam it doesn't work to implement these strategies, given its history for reason A or B, then we might be able to say something about other environments which also have to deal with reason A or B. So that being said, the current sort of trajectory in Amsterdam related to sustainability and especially circular economy, for me, sort of got sparked here at this moment in April 2020, when the City Council came out with their donut economy model, the Amsterdam City Donut. It was at the height of the first lockdown when the City Council came out with this strategy to reconceptualize the local economy. And I'll get back to what the City Donut is in a minute. But just to remind you and also myself of the time in which this came out, it was this time where COVID was, it had just started and everyone was rethinking what this meant for the way we organize the global economy. And what happened in Amsterdam with this strategy was also picked up internationally to some degree as a way to radically rethink how local urban economies work. And Amsterdam did this as part of their circular strategy that came out in tandem with this donut economy model. So they want to reduce the use of primary raw materials and then be eventually 100% circular by 2050. And they focus on the areas of food and organic waste, consumer goods, and the built environment. So what is this donut economy? That's the following picture. It was introduced by a British economist, Kate Raworth, and she's been working with the city council in Amsterdam to bring this sort of down to a local scale. And this donut economy is basically a conceptualization of the economy as the space between a social foundation, which should ensure that all citizens are met in their basic needs. So I don't know if you can read it, but you see things that social act, housing, food, basically the sustainable development subsidies. At the same time, when we do try to meet these needs, we cannot overshoot the boundaries of our planet, the sort of planetary boundaries or the ecological ceiling. So the just and safe space to move within is that light green space. And in a city context, this then brings or introduces certain lenses through which policy-making processes and policies themselves can be assessed or judged, combining social and ecological and local and global considerations. But these four lenses are then sort of always driving discussions about where the city is headed. And as I mentioned, also in this case, Amsterdam has a quite clear focus on citizens and communities. And I quote here from the strategy document. It says that Amsterdam is ideally positioned to use the portrait as a tool of transformative action. The city has been recognized for its Amsterdam approach to collaborative innovation, which connects neighborhood initiatives, startups, and civil society with the established institutions of government, business, and knowledge institutions. Furthermore, the city is home to a dynamic network of change makers who are already using donut-inspired thinking to drive systemic change. So I think we've seen many iterations of public and private partnerships and such, but I think there's a quite clear focus here on neighborhood initiatives and also this dynamic network of change makers. And this dynamic network of change makers got sort of more materialized, if you will, in what they call the Amsterdam Donut Coalition. It's an organization or coalition, I guess, of small organizations, local entrepreneurs, and citizens who are interested, both community organizers, but also people who are just interested in this, who are trying to drive this implementation of the donut. So ultimately, what I'm interested in is how the city might be a place where we can foster alternative forms of social, economic, and political organizing that contribute to just sustainable urban transformation. That's sort of the overall interest I have. But both for the sake of the time that we have and my empirical work, I try to sort of boil this down empirically to looking at what is happening around the Amsterdam donut economy. So I'm both interested in the actors, the alliances that arise around this and their practices and strategies, but also at the larger political economic context in which this takes place. So I have a sort of twofold approach that I'm currently trying to sort of bring together, which seems quite difficult, but I want to sort of test how this attempt by local citizens and the state in some areas is succeeding, if you will. So this is also the part that I will focus on mostly as a way to try to understand how and when and if these kinds of initiatives might succeed. So under what conditions can we think about driving this kind of change? And as I said, I work qualitatively, which means that on the ground in Amsterdam, I've had interviews with with this rising network, this coalition. I've interviewed people both online and offline. It was quite interesting at the start of this this whole development, this initiative. The whole world was basically still online, large parts of it at least, and it gave me quite nice opportunities to be present while still in Denmark. It was quite interesting to see this network arise online as well. They did both online and in-person meetups and events, workshops, and also more sort of outreach events where they presented what was going on in the network. I've been part of some of those, and I've visited some of the neighborhood projects that I will give some examples of later on. And then to look more at the sort of political economic context, I've tried to understand what is going on in terms of urban development and urban policies in Amsterdam currently, or over time also the sort of historical development of Amsterdam's urban development, and to sort of, provide the background of the current developments. So I will talk a little bit about my findings there. So mostly I will talk today about these happenings on the ground, so the actors, the alliances, and strategies that are used to introduce different kinds of logics, but also the policy landscape. And I will talk about that on 3 levels. I'll start at the bottom, and I will interpret what is going on in terms of donut economics on the ground, in terms of diverse economic practices and urban everyday politics, to sort of understand how these people are using thinking around the donut economy as a way to transform their livelihoods and have a say in how that happens. At the same time, I think this initiative is very interesting because it has this sort of citywide coalition, and it really tries to establish a network of change and interact with other types of networks on the city level to strengthen what's going on in the neighborhood. And as a part of that, and I will talk about that thirdly, is the relation between the citizens and the state that becomes very much in focus of these initiatives. They all try to reconsider how the state can bring in the lived experiences of citizens across the city in various neighborhoods under very different living circumstances. So I think there's change happening on several levels, and I think that's what makes this interesting. So where does this story start? Well, I think a lot of sort of background conditions that Amsterdam is currently facing is nicely captured in the latest spatial strategy. This was published in 21 and presents the vision for 2050. And one of the main themes here is to accommodate growth and the scarcity of urban space. Amsterdam has been growing quite steadily since the 1990s. After a period of shrinkage in the early 90s, late 80s, the city really started to take off. And this is then also one of the main themes, how to accommodate the increasing pressure on urban space and the competing interests that are related. So the city came up with, and I hope this is a sensible English translation, but a multi-nuclear development strategy where they focus mostly on the north, New West, or it's called New West because it was built later than the rest of the West, and Southeast, these green areas. And perhaps not surprising, these areas in many ways are also the most deprived areas of the cities. Those
can you go back to before the green popped up? Do you know why in like the top area, why the right half of that highway was like undeveloped previously? Or
you mean here?
Yeah.
I think it is not developed now, or what do you mean?
Or I guess I'm asking why the Amsterdam's like city layout is so like particular. Like it's pretty dense and then there's like nothing there, for example, like on the left side and then like in the bottom right as well.
I think that's really how the city grew over time. So this is the historic center.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, especially with different waves of immigration, the city started to expand.
Yeah.
unevenly. And this area, I mean, they built the ring road, of course, to increase mobility, but this space has just not been in focus. I think what is also interesting in the Dutch context is that people are quite particular about how much they like to move, and living here is kind of feeling like you're not in the city. And I think Amsterdam is very dense in the way it's built historically, especially since the 80s. I think it's a psychological thing, and it's becoming more in focus now. But I think historically it wasn't necessary to look at that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah. So these areas are the most deprived areas in certain ways. Here's a map of the standard life situation index, sort of quality of life in 8 areas like consumption and vacation and social relations. And here you really see that the southeast is performing quite poorly, but if we zoom in a little closer, also in New West, you see that these red areas start to appear. In terms of unemployment, quite similar, and here the north is doing better. But also there, if you zoom in on sort of neighborhood level, it's much more segregated, and also red dots appear. And then,
Got a question.
oh yeah, sure.
That red spot, is that Belmer?
This one, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's larger than that, but the Belmer is part of it. Yeah, exactly. So normally the borough is called Southeast, and the Belmer is part of it. And then in terms of migration background, which is sort of the generally accepted way of talking about factors of migration, but also ethnicity. Here you see a map of the city, and the darker it gets, the more people in the city who were born in the Netherlands and both whose parents were also born in the Netherlands. So the lighter and the grayer the areas are, the more people with a migration background are present. This is a quite specific case. It's a municipality that joined Amsterdam, I think officially in 2021. And it's been a very sort of separated town, if you will, and a very ethnic white Dutch municipality as such. So they only joined the city recently, which was also why you saw a small spike in inhabitant numbers. But that's why it's so dark blue there. But going back to these 3 areas, these 3 boroughs that are the focus for economic development, but also specifically cultural development in terms of cultural centers and things like this. What is interesting in relation to my study here is that these areas are also quite vibrant in terms of community organizations and developments that are specifically relating to this donut economics strategy. I won't have time to go into all of these, of course, but I will touch upon a couple of them to show how this strategy is both sparking civic engagement and how these local developments are sort of giving flesh to this ongoing policy. And then, as I said, I'll start on the neighborhood level. So I'm interpreting what is going on there in kind of through 2 lenses. One is a diverse economies approach, and the other one is the idea of urban everyday politics. Diverse economies, you might have heard about it. The concept of Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson, they kind of argue that despite perhaps persisting global capitalist logics, there's a lot going on in our current society that has different logics and different ways of organizing things and relating to other people. They give plenty of examples of care work, of cooperative forms of organizing. And all these examples come with different ideas of how people relate to one another and how they practice economics. So we should be sensitive to all this diversity, and we should sort of try to really engage with what is going on there. We should try to sort of understand what kind of possibilities lie in that and give thick descriptions of what the outcomes might be. There is.
I have a question. You're talking about diversity thing, but essentially things need to be done So what do you suggest needs to be done? I would love to.
I want to repeat.
Yeah, so you're asking me what I think, given the diversity that we have. Sorry, I can't even repeat it, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm just asking, when you talk about the diversity of neighborhoods and things that need to be done,
Mhm.
what do you think needs to be done? I'm just trying to get different people, because everybody's opinion means.
Mhm. Yeah, so I'll just repeat it. Your question is what my opinion is on what we should do with all this diversity and what direction we should go into. Well, I think it's actually a question that I'm thinking about a lot. And what I find maybe a comfortable position, but also an informative one right now, is to see what people on the ground in those communities actually want. Because I'm very aware of the fact that I have 2 Dutch parents and I was born in the Netherlands. When I lived in Amsterdam, I mainly moved around in these nice areas over here. There is a very sort of spatially segregated aspect to this city. So I'm mostly interested in hearing what those people have to say about it and finding ways of translating those ideas and those wishes that they have to the local state, to citizens like me who were not so aware of that. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a cowardish answer, but
It's not a ghost. Really, it's an answer.
thank you. It's an important question, and I think it is really important for me to realize that Amsterdam is such a historically segregated city, and that I have very few ideas of what it is to live down here. Yeah, so I'm trying to engage actively with trying to understand what happens on the ground and take that seriously, despite, we can always make an argument about global streams of capitalism limiting that, but actually to try to see what comes out of these. At the same time, I think there's, of course, as you will all agree with, there's something specific about being in an urban context. And here I think trying to work with the concept of urban everyday politics developed by Ross Beveridge and Philip Koch is quite interesting because it draws our attention to, I think, 2 things. One is, well, as the term says, one is everyday life and the other one is the urban. And it's really this idea that through everyday encounters and practices that we organize in our everyday life in a community, we can politicize that urban life. We can engage with our surroundings, we can take active part in shaping it. And at the same time, because it is in an area or in a sort of context where space is scarce and struggled over, it does something to that space. So the urban becomes in play, or comes into play, is put at stake in both the struggle to get that space, but also to shape it in different ways. So I'm seeing both of these developments or concepts kind of at play in Amsterdam, because people are trying to experiment with, for example, new forms of ownership, of value, and of work. At the same time, they're trying to build relationships between citizens, both in neighborhoods, but also across boundaries of neighborhoods. And in that process to really empower people in those neighborhoods. And again, in mostly these deprived neighborhoods with historically very little of a say in development of the city. And then in maybe a later step, but very much implied into this, is the idea of sustainability, and in a more recent way also the circular economy, of not only focusing on the social aspect, but really also bringing in the other dimension of the donut in this case, which is the environmental aspect.
Cheryl, are you mentioning these things as something that came out of your third cohort, or still a framing issue?
How I frame it?
Yeah, is this still part of the framing you're going to show us what you find empirical, or is this already?
No, it is part of my framing of the case, but I'll come with some quotes that support this. And I will touch upon especially also how the state comes into play here, because I think looking at what's happening on the ground is very interesting and informative, and at times very hopeful. But to continue the existence of all these developments, I think it's crucial that we look at how the state might or might not support them. So to give you a little bit of a sense of how this actually looks, as I said, I've done interviews. In this case, it was an interview with the founder of what's called the Green Hub, located in the southeast. And this is a center located in an old school building. You can see it very vaguely in the background, which is located exactly on the border kind of the more wealthy and affluent part of the neighborhood and the less affluent, mostly social housing area. And this whole school building with the organization in it is really trying to work in a sort of three-step approach, which is also what the founder here explained to me, which is to start with the social dimension of being in a neighborhood and relating to your neighbors and people in the community. Then focusing on the sort of more democratic empowerment of people. So how can you get them involved in larger scale processes that affect the neighborhood? And then the sustainability aspect, circular economy in many ways. And this really comes into many different forms, I think, here. They've experimented with doing local currencies. They're still building a local currency to retain value in the community. They've started a bike repair cafe, employing people who are formerly unemployed, and at the same time to promote biking, despite the Dutch being a very biking people. This is an area where this still happens less. So that's another sort of way of combining these things. They've done things with bio-waste digesters and kind of addressing energy poverty in many different ways. And what they do here is really taking inspiration again from this donut. And she explained to me, and the founder was very sort of firm about connecting it to this language of donut economics, where they combine three issues from the social inside, and then one at least issue of the environmental side, and work together with partners to address them. And she here in the quote summarizes that this three-step method really works in a sense that they ask people, do you know how the game is played? And the game is of urban development of democracy. And you know, the game, that's actually quite unfair. So we will teach them how to empower themselves. And then we find creative solutions to engage with circular economy and sustainability. So here you see reflected a little bit the social, democratic, and environmental aspect.
I'm curious on this diagram, what is considered the outside and what is the inside, like looking at 1 and 3, for example?
Yeah, so they try to combine the environmental considerations of the donut model
Right.
with three issues from the social dimension.
I see, gotcha.
So whenever they engage with partners to establish new projects, they will think about how this relates to social issues in the neighborhood and more environmental dimensions.
Gotcha. So it sounds like you're always, if you're working with this organization, you're always looking for pairings like that. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Gotcha.
Exactly. So in a way, they're trying to experiment with new forms of work, new forms of relations between people, and of course then sustainability. And another example is the community land trust that they're trying to establish a little north from the project I just talked about, where they really try to build a community in the face of urban renewal that will take place in this specific neighborhood, where they try to find a way both for people to collectively own the land, but also to make space for the community where they can sort of strengthen the relations between them and give these people a platform to have a say. So here, one of the advisors that works with this community tells me that the goal is also to include the people from the neighborhood and the community. So it's not only about the collective ownership, but also about the community. For example, there's a lady who organizes all kinds of activities on the square. There's someone who likes to cook for the neighborhood. And the goal is really to ensure that these linking pins of the municipality get a place and take part in discussions about the development of the area. So they're trying to rethink ownership of housing and of land in this case, but also empower the community and strengthen this community. And on top of that, here in the background, you see an urban farm that they've been developing, they're looking into circular forms of housing construction. So again, the sort of sustainable aspect also comes into play. Zooming out a little bit, I know this were only sort of 2 examples, but many of these logics go through several of these projects. But as I mentioned earlier, I think what is interesting here is that there's also a sort of citywide development with this coalition arising. So not only do we have all this action taking place in communities, which I'm sure you see many places, there is also a serious engagement with larger scales and how to translate and sort of foster all this activity on larger scales. So I'll talk a little bit about the city scale now. And here, to think about it in terms of the framing a little bit, I'm interested in how we might be able to foster all this local engagement, to bring into play a more sort of high level comparison of these things and sort of understanding the mechanisms on all these local developments, but also what that means for change on the larger scale. So what kind of multi-level actors come into play that might help cohesion in this whole development and network, mutual learning, but also if we think about the fact that in many parts of society we see more divide and polarization, how can we conceptualize coalitions of change? How can we bring people together in a way that it's not divisive, but actually bringing together a powerful assemblage for change? And I think in this case, this donut coalition plays a quite vital role. And here one person involved with them quite closely tells me that there is this desire to learn from one another. That desire is always there and it's very strong. But this is difficult to organize, especially because from an operational and very practical point of view, everyone is busy with their own initiatives. So you need a well-organized intermediate layer. And I think this is true for all of these projects, that people to a full extent or a large extent work on this in their private time. They don't get paid for it. So how do you foster that? How do you help them to be able to carry out these things? And here the Amsterdam Donut Coalition comes in. It's an online platform for one thing. So I think I checked last week, and they feature at the moment 91 projects, 634 persons, and 41 organizations. And some of them are very closely involved. Others are sort of more interested, especially the persons. They have a sort of varied range of how closely involved they are. But these are all people that express their support and try to be part of this change. And what they do, apart from collecting all this initiative on a platform, is to organize events, to share knowledge, not only through the events, but I think it's a main tool. Here on the left side, I was part of a workshop in the Green Hub, this old school building that I talked about earlier, where they talked about local currencies. So how can we develop ways of circulating in neighborhoods that really retain value? You mentioned the Bijlmer. It's one of the most economically productive areas of the city, with the most economic product in that area, and then right next to it you have people living in the most deprived areas. So it's really about thinking how we might change those logics. And they also do more larger sort of outreach, where they also invited the inventor of this donut model to share knowledge more widely, to present some of these really hardworking people for a larger audience, again, to spark further action. The Amsterdam Donut Coalition is not the only sort of network that's interesting here. They're really also trying to be a network of networks. And just to mention a few of those, this one, O2025, is a network of energy cooperatives through the city. We're trying to have an energy commissioner in each postal code area that makes it easy for people to reach out to someone if they are interested in establishing a cooperative, and share knowledge and the learning of all the sort of hiccups in that process. MAC O20 is a coalition again of both people within the city government and local entrepreneurs and citizens to think about how processes of city making can become more democratic. It's part of the democratization program of the city council. And they're really trying to establish stronger ties between the city and its citizens. And then Max is a national platform that's very active in Amsterdam with the aim to quantify social value or neighborhood value. So they're trying to bring into play another aspect in, for example, tenders for public projects by trying to quantify what a project does or a project proposal for the local surroundings of that project. And then the last example here is Women Make the City. It's a kind of a combination of different women's councils across the city that engage with the city government to discuss plans for urban development and proposals from the perspective of women in those areas. And again, here it mostly correlates with those three boroughs that I showed on the map. And then they have a citywide council. And this is again really with the intention to bring those experiences of women in the city in those areas to the sort of more overall direction in which the city is going. And I think part of all of this, and also this whole donut economics direction, is to strengthen the interactions between local citizens, the local state and citizens. And here is an example of the neighborhood donut, which someone in New West, so the Western borough that I showed earlier, made to sort of find a language to talk to the local government. So many of these people involved try to change the logics of urban government by bringing in citizens into play and include them in planning of the city. They try to bring in sustainable practices, but they are looking for ways to justify their claims. And this is one way they've been doing it. So they've been collecting ideas of what's going on in the neighborhood, what are the main problems and things to address. And they've given that to the state to address that and to help them find ways. And the main sort of driver of this put it the following way, that the idea is that you can map out the neighborhood with this model and say to the municipality, well, look, this is the situation. What shall we do about it? The idea is then that you indeed find a way to act on it.
This is really interesting. I want to make sure I understand. So are you saying in this example, there were people from the community who took a look at what was happening in their community and then drew this donut behind, kind of filled it in with their own examples, their own language and words, and sort of took the language of the states, this donut model that had come from policymakers, and then handed it back to local policymakers and said, here's what your model looks like here. Is that what happened?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what happened. So here, for example, they talk about how too much concrete and brick in the neighborhood creates heating. I think it's quite
Sure.
to
Yeah.
what you're doing, but they're really trying to talk, and you see them the social sort of aspects fill up way more. But I guess that's also the nature of this, like how do you bring global warming to the local scale? Well, if you're thinking about it, I know about it. But yeah, exactly this, to find a tool to talk to the local government and get a foot in the door with what they think is needed.
And in this case, they use the language and the tool of the local government to try to communicate.
Exactly. And I think it's also good to say that many of the initiatives that I've been talking about predate to a large extent this model, but they've really been using this language to push it forward. And as I said, I'm also really trying to understand in what kind of larger context this takes place. So I will talk very briefly about the local state in this, in terms of housing, urban space, and sustainability. It will be very brief. But housing, as probably anywhere else at the moment, is a big theme. affordability and availability. But in Amsterdam, since 2017, they've actually had the 40-40-20 principle, where they, for every newly constructed housing project, 40% of it should be rent regulated, so social housing, 40% should be mid-range, and then 20% should be expensive rent. On newly constructed buildings, this is actually happening to a large degree. Here you see a social unit in a sort of newly developed business district. On top of this, they've been developing the self-occupation duty to really limit the possibility for renting out dwellings after transformation or purchase, I think after July 2020. So again, only relatively recent units, but really to kind of bring down the amount of people who buy up housing and, you know, rent it out. And then the Purchase Protection Act is again a similar thing, but then for existing units. So after sale of specific units, the local government has now this tool to say, to limit again the possibilities of renting it out. So I think they're trying in many ways to make the city accessible, or to make it more accessible than it currently is. It's difficult because I think when they implemented this rule in 2017, the amount of social housing was actually higher at that point. So it is still in decline, but they're trying to sort of protect what is there maybe.
And it's a number very high, right? Like 50%.
Yeah, I think the Netherlands. Yes,
50.
yeah, it's really high. This is a long history of both Dutch planning, but also the city of Amsterdam itself. Yeah, but it has been, especially since the 2000s, going steadily down. And at the same time, there are qualitative changes. Housing is getting smaller, and the city puts up objectives or aims to keep housing sizes such that small families might be able to live in such housing, but they're not quite meeting those standards. Then urban space, quite interesting in Amsterdam, the city government owns about 80% of the land. They have since end of 1800s. So they have a very large role in, you know, defining the socio-spatial mix in the city, to develop housing or to influence the development of housing. They're also very dependent on the proceeds from the land use change. And this is increasingly a problem in times of declining national funds and subsidies for cities. But Amsterdam has always been very active in promoting the use of its space. And I think the sort of the pressure on urban space that we see currently is very much also the result of a long-standing international campaign to put Amsterdam on a map. And you might have all at some point perhaps seen this I Amsterdam or heard about it. It was really this idea to put Amsterdam on the international map in the early 2000s. It was connected to certain Pearl projects, like the business trip that I mentioned earlier, the one which had the social unit. So even in the development of this Pearl project in the 2000s, they did manage to, and they're still developing it, but to keep the social housing there. And currently, the ongoing public debates on whether maybe this strategy has been a bit too successful. The pressure on the inner city of tourism is really rising, and discussion is on whether we're maybe attracting the wrong type of tourists is also increasing, with lots of bachelor parties and loud tourists. So there's a growing idea that maybe we should protect this space that is becoming increasingly scarce. And the government, the local government came out with a strategy to protect what they call free space. It's an iteration of an ongoing sort of process where they try to free up space for free space for kind of non-profitable activities. So citizens can come with their proposals to use space in a more artistic way that will most likely not yield their own profits. So they're trying to make space for these kinds of initiatives. Well, the sort of salient fact of this is that when they came out with this strategy, they had just abolished or sort of evicted the last real logistic-free community in one of the old dockyards. It was a long process, but in early 2019, they were quite forcefully evicted. And after some iterations, the space actually didn't belong to the local state. They tried to buy it, but there was a difficult process and it didn't work. And then it was sold to an entrepreneur who's turning it into a luxury yacht. Marina, really? To show that, you know, it's a messy process. And that's probably not surprising, but many different interests at play. And then largely, I will speed up a little bit. It's the sustainability practices, because one thing is this circular strategy, but Amsterdam also has a strategy to become climate neutral, as they call it, or CO2 neutral. And also in that strategy, they're really emphasizing the citizens and the justice of it, with car-free zones and green spaces, civic engagement in urban collectives like this. But of course, there's a larger sort of context to that. And it becomes quite ambivalent with the implementation of district heating, where again, it was promised that citizens would be included in the process. They would have a say of how their neighborhoods would transform to renewable energy. But this was a very contentious process with a deal that had already been made with Vattenfall, or at least to some degree, on the table, that citizens felt like they were not included. And this became quite a political disaster also for the city government, because they were not able to accommodate the voice of citizens. And I think when we look at these strategies, we should also remain critical. For one thing, they've left out the international airport in the calculations of the emissions. It's formally in a different municipality, but it's of course also quite convenient to have this international attraction point, but not, you know, take it into account with the emissions. And then for the harbor and also large industry as a whole, the city does refer and has to refer to regional, national and EU legislation. So I think the ambition is there, but what it actually does in the end is still a question, very much. I will jump over this example, which is interesting, but present you with maybe some preliminary learnings. As I said, I'm still sort of grappling with all this. But what I think this model, this donut economy does very nicely is to spark citizen engagement, to make them feel part of a bigger sort of development. They see this springing up not only in Amsterdam, but also in other countries, other cities. And they're able to talk to actors on different scales, such as the government. The policy discourse among city officials is also changing. So there is hopefully a language being built between these different actors. But also, as I've hinted at several times, you know, these engaged citizens ultimately have to deal with limited time and resources, but also space. Who gets to do what kind of project and where? And I think, especially in this example, there was never a really widespread structural funding for all these small-scale projects. So the government, on the one hand, wanted to have this driven by citizens, but never really came with a very sort of open and widespread funding strategy for this. And this, I think, leads to a quite uncoordinated process of change, which on the one hand is good because it gives a lot of space for people in local communities. But at the moment, their sort of motto for driving this movement is to go where the energy is, which is very understandable in light of having limited resources, but it does lead to forms of exclusion that I think we should be very aware of. And hopefully in the end, you know, March 24, I'll be able to say a bit more about what this means for urban climate politics, because I think especially in light of all these strategies that emphasize that we need to move fast, we need to learn while doing, etc., etc. I think we really need to be aware of what kind of exclusionary tendencies we build in with those things. And hopefully this case will, you know, be able to tell us about that. But I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're almost on time, but if you don't mind, we'll take a few
I know,
questions.
please.
I hope you'll appreciate a blast from the 21st century. It is possible. You know, it is happening in places. So, you know, always room for improvement, but it's good to hear about all these examples.
Yeah.
It seems like having a clear vision of something conceptual framework that the government is open to, that opens up all these possibilities.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So any questions? Yeah, please. Thank you.
Are there any other similar like coalitions, in other European countries where they have like civil societies engaged and like do you have good examples that yielded results that are comparable?
I think one aspect of this donut movement, if you will, what's quite interesting is that this is really springing up in many different places. I think Amsterdam in that movement is often considered to be, you know, the best kid in the class because they're further ahead. But it is sparking similar developments elsewhere with, in some cases, more engaged city officials and in other cases, more civic engagement or civil society. So yeah, the aspiration, at least in this movement, is that it's a global thing eventually. Aim high and then, you know. Yeah, please.
I'm wondering about this metaphor and its nuances, especially in the context of the Netherlands.
Mhm.
I'll tell you what I mean. Like here in the US, at least from my perspective, donuts, it's not a serious food. You know, it's like it's not healthy. It's like people make jokes about donuts, you know. So you know, but like the donut should be like your model for like the sustainable future. It strikes me as being a little goofy, you know, and even like in some of the like the logo for the donut coalition you showed, that's sort of kind of playful, you know. So I'm wondering, first of all, what do donuts mean to Dutch people? But also, like, is there actually some, is that kind of like an intention at a certain level to make this a little bit more accessible, a little bit like less kind of technocratic than so much of the other kind of sustainability sort of messaging?
Thanks for that question. Yes, donuts are not a highly regarded thing in the Netherlands, and the model actually came from England. But I guess the same goes there. But the question about play, I think, is a really good one, and I didn't really mention that, but it's very much part of what they're trying to do. Make it accessible, go where the energy is, make it fun to participate, and it's mixed. I think when you talk to people who try to show this model, you know, in their local communities, some will jump on it immediately. Others feel like, okay, what's this sort of? It's still quite abstract, despite it trying to be sort of very visual and accessible. But I think they've been struggling a little bit with this bad publicity around donuts. Some now call it the one and only donut that will be healthy for us, or they bake bagels instead of donuts to make it more sort of, I mean, they're trying to, you know, work with that, but it's definitely a playful movement, or they try to.
You notice it's spelled right. Yeah, okay. I had sort of a question, if I may interject it, which is that a lot of the enemy of this kind of thing that you, at least seems to me you described, that there's a certain conceptual view that we're more or less aligned with, and then they can fill in with their own reality and aspirations. That often is missing, right? From a city like Chicago, it probably is missing in most of the United States. That we have sort of a conceptual framework for the city, and it's just a matter of us expressing ourselves in it. And also that there's political continuity in having a vision. So I know this is all relatively new, but some of the challenges have been that all these processes of development take many years, and the next mayor decides no donut. For me, it's a different way to go, and the whole process just gets stopped. So, but this doesn't seem to be happening. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How is it that there's
Yeah.
consensus about this?
It's a good point, because of course also this is very political within the city government.
Mhm.
And there was a change of city council last year, and the new elder person is not so fan of this donut model because it's not hers.
Right.
So it is very much part of that. But I think what it still very well does is to sort of inspire this on the ground movement. And they're quite concerned, the people in this movement, of whether it will still be a useful language going forward. but they're also very pragmatic about it. They'll be like, if the next language is this, it will still sort of drive or enable us to talk about the things that we find important. So I'm personally quite doubtful whether this is actually gonna be the long-term vision of the city. But in this moment, I think it's captured, and I'm already speaking past tense, but it captured quite well what was going on and how this might be an intermediate level, but how long term that will be. Sure.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe just one follow-up question. I mean, I've spent some time in Amsterdam, and if you walk around in the city center and
Yeah.
you go to Amsterdam West or Oost, you do notice the differences in the areas. I mean, one part is already like the real estate market. If you want to buy up something in the center, it's unpayable, it's in the millions. But then in the other areas, much more affordable. But then a lot of these areas are also socioeconomically less developed. And so to me, the donut economy seems like new lingo for old problems where there is a problem of equity and equality between different areas. So ultimately, in the longer run, would this be the solution to try to bring that down? Or is there actually any other alternative that is mainly focused on, recalibrating that equality and equity issue in Amsterdam?
I think your question also kind of has to do with trade-offs, which I think this model doesn't at all answer, because it tries to, bring together all these aspects that we need to be considerate of. But then if we have two deprived areas with a great idea, this model will not tell us whether we should, give the funds or the space or the time or whatever to one or the other. So I think what this model does really well is, again, this bottom-up engagement, but it will always be a political decision what type of policies we make, because we cannot, as nice as it is to aim for that, I think there are always trade-offs and blind spots. So is that somewhat of an answer?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very much a new way of looking at old problems, but hopefully a way to include more perspectives in driving the solutions.
Is this kind of bottom up? Is this kind of what Amsterdam has done 70 years or things that 70 years ago, like a US city, right?
Sorry, did you say 70?
70.
Yeah.
Right, it looked like a US city, like LA, and decisions were kind of made persistently to make it into the biking city. Not totally, but there was much more similarity. Cars were much more different here. Is that part of that process? Is this like in the DNA of the city to kind of do civic engagement from the bottom up, or is this new?
I think they will say, like, people involved in this will say that Amsterdam has this culture of civic engagement and listening to multiple voices. I think I have traced it back to the 60s when urban movements and squatter movements really tried to have a say against urban renewal. At that time, there was another political debacle with an alderman who had to step down, and a new one who came instead of this one and really tried to work with those communities to think about urban renewal and urban development. I think that's where it started, where maybe Amsterdam as a US kind of city became a bit more citizen-oriented, perhaps. But it also, I think it has to do a lot with the Netherlands is a very strong social democracy after the war, and that started to decline quite greatly after, 80s, 90s. And I feel like this is maybe a development in the Netherlands that the pushback of that more neoliberal model is kind of too much now, and that's why also on the national level, a lot of housing policies are currently developed to counter the commodification of housing. So it's probably a combination of national culture and planning standards or approaches with things like the squatter movement in the city in the 60s.
Would you say this is typical of Amsterdam, or is it happening all over the Netherlands, also in smaller places?
I guess I'm not sure if I can properly answer that, but I think it is happening elsewhere similarly. But there is maybe a certain way in which people in Amsterdam also try to think of themselves as the avant-garde of whatever development it is. And I think I'm actually quite interested in looking at this, for example, in Rotterdam, which is a much more underdog city, but which I think in perhaps different ways, but has similar tendencies. But I haven't studied it enough to know that.
Great. I think, thank you.